The storm came in on the third day, the way mountain storms always do on Kethalon, no warning, just a wall of white that swallowed the ridge road and sealed the cabin for the duration. I had been a field surgeon for 11 years by then. I was used to being snowed in. I was not used to finding what I found under the supply sledge when I went to check the runners that first morning. She was smaller than I had words for at first, wrapped in a cargo blanket that had been folded around her with care, with intention, by hands that were no longer there. Her skin was the color of pale heather, a dusty lavender that caught the flat stormlight and held it. Her ears came to points. Her eyes, when she finally opened them, were silver gray and very large, pupils wide from cold or from fear or from both. She looked at me without looking away. I carried her inside. I will not claim I knew what I was doing. I had a diagnostic wand calibrated for human physiology, oxygen rated for human lungs, analgesics designed for human pain thresholds, and a xenobiology reference set that covered 17 species and did not include hers. I used the wand anyway. I used the oxygen at reduced flow and watched her chest to see what it did. I watched her for a long time before I touched her, and when I did I moved slowly, and I talked to her the way I talk to patients who cannot understand me, because I have learned in 11 years that the voice matters when the words do not. Her lungs were the problem. I had worked that out by the second day. Whatever air she had been breathing before the storm, lower altitude, warmer, something chemically gentler than what the cabin recyclers produced, the mountain air was doing incremental damage I could not reverse and could only slow. I rationed the oxygen. I kept her warm. I fed her small amounts of reconstituted broth, which she accepted, and I learned over several careful attempts that she had 3 distinct vocalizations, one that meant agreement, one that meant refusal, and one that meant she was paying attention to something I had said. There was also a low hum, a sustained sound she produced when she was calm, that was not quite a word and not quite a song. That hum became the thing I measured every hour against. When it stopped, I stopped what I was doing and listened until it came back. I named her Keth for the mountain. She turned her head when I said it, so I kept saying it. On the 4th day, I found the token. It was sewn into the lining of the cargo blanket, deep in a folded hem, a disc of carved bone, no larger than my thumbnail, with a pattern on both faces that I recognized as coordinate notation from 2 years on a border survey team before medical school. The coordinates pointed 3 ridge systems west. I knew, from the colony maps I kept on my tablet, that there was a Vithani resettlement cluster established there the previous spring. Someone had sewn that token into the blanket so that whoever found her would know where she came from. They had planned for the worst and made sure the worst still carried an address. The relay antenna had come down on the storm's first night. I could not reach anyone. I set the token on the shelf above the stove where I could see it, and I went back to work. By the 6th day she had stopped flinching when I moved near her. She allowed me to examine her without the preliminary stillness she had held herself in at first, that exhausting, careful stillness of a creature that has learned to become very small when it is uncertain. She still used the stillness sometimes in the mornings before she had fully registered where she was, but it passed faster each day. On the 6th morning she watched me prep the oxygen line, her silver eyes tracking each step, and when I turned to attach the cannula she tilted her head forward slightly, offering. And something in that small cooperation, that single act of trust granted to a stranger with unfamiliar hands, required a moment before I could continue. On the 6th afternoon she reached into my open ration pack and took out a piece of dried fruit slowly, and considered it for a long moment before she put it in her mouth. I did not react. I kept writing in my log. She took a second piece. Then she looked at me directly, the way she had looked at me the first morning under the sledge, that same clear, measuring attention, and she produced the low hum, brief and even, as if confirming something she had decided about me. That small act, made quietly and without ceremony, cost me something I had not expected to pay. I had kept my composure for 6 days. I kept it for 6 more hours after that, and then I stepped outside into the storm for a few minutes and let the cold have it instead. The storm began to break on the 7th day. By the 8th morning I could see the ridge road through the cabin window. I calculated the window. A supply crawler was due at the lower way station before nightfall, the kind that diverted for medical flags, and if I could get her down the road in daylight, I could signal it and get her to lower altitude before the next front came in. Lower altitude meant warmer air, meant less demand on lungs that had been working harder than they were made to work for 8 days in a mountain cabin that was the wrong altitude, the wrong temperature, the wrong everything. 6 hours. I had perhaps 6 hours from first light to make it work. She did not make it to the 6th hour. I will not describe the last 2 hours in this record because this record is not the place for it, and because what happened in those 2 hours belongs to her and not to any file system. I will say that she was not alone. I will say that the hum did not stop until it did. I will say that the silence that followed was the loudest thing I encountered in 11 years of field medicine, and that I sat with it for a while before I stood up and began doing what came next. When the crawler reached the way station, I was waiting at the road. The operator was a young man I had met once before at a resupply exchange. He asked if I was all right. I told him I had been alone in the cabin for 9 days and that the storm had been a bad one. He logged it. I signed the log. At the regional medical station, I filed my field report. Storm duration, supply consumption, personal health assessment, no significant medical incidents, no other personnel or dependents present at the site during the closure period. I wrote it carefully. I wrote it correctly in the sense that every word I wrote was a word I chose. I submitted it before I slept. The report is in the record system. It has been there for 4 years. I know what it says because I wrote it, and I know why I wrote it because I had looked at those coordinates for 8 days and I had read, the month before the storm, the Border Authority's compliance audit of the Vethani resettlement cluster, a routine administrative notice, the kind that precedes a census review, the kind that can become, if a file gives it cause, a restriction order. A child found dead on a mountain is a file. A file in the wrong system is a reason. I was not willing to give them a reason. I burned the cargo blanket. I kept the token. Every year in the late summer before the first snow, I take leave and I go back to the ridge. I hike up in the morning and I sit above the cabin for an hour, maybe 2, on the flat shelf of rock that looks west. The cabin below is quiet. The ridge road is usually empty. The air up there is thin and cold even in summer, and it smells like mineral dust and the particular dryness of altitude. And I breathe it without difficulty because I am built for it, because my lungs are the right lungs for this mountain, because I have that and she did not. I look west toward where the settlement is, 3 ridge systems away, and I think about the hands that folded that blanket and sewed the token into the hem, and sent a small child out into a storm-season mountain with coordinates for a home she was supposed to reach. I think about what it costs to make that kind of plan, what it costs to fold a blanket that carefully, to choose a disc of carved bone and push it through a needle hole in the hem, and then to let go. I think about what it means to trust a stranger with everything, because there was no other option left, because the only thing left to do was make sure the stranger knew where she came from. I think about that every year and I have not finished thinking about it yet. The official record says she was never there. I know I wrote it.